Hey, welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Bourbon Bytes. I'm your host, Terry McGraw from Cape Endeavors Incorporated. Today, I have the honor and privilege of speaking with Mackenzie Eaglen. Mackenzie is not only the chairman of the National Commission on the Future of the United States Navy, but she's also a senior resident fellow with the American Enterprise Institute. And thank you again, Mackenzie, for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Mackenzie, for those of you, for those in our audience that may not be as briefed in sort of the role that you've been playing in support of our defense department as well as the defense industrial base in general, how did you fall into this? I mean, you've been a obviously very thoughtful researcher and influencer in this space for a very long time, but it's not necessarily the straightest path to getting to where you are. How did you sort of fall into this as your area of expertise and area of interest?
Well, a long time ago, I thought I might fly helicopters for the United States Army. And it's a great story over actual bourbon to go into that fun, why it didn't work out very briefly. It was this thing I didn't know about. And so the Army was like, you're not really medically helpful if you can't crawl around on the ground. And so I said, well, we have this great system in the United States of America where we have civilian control of the military. So I said, I'm going to work at the Pentagon, which is probably like a better plan. I don't love taking orders anyway. And so I worked my way up to DC and I started at the Pentagon on 9/11. That was my first day.
Oh, wow. That's a tough day to start. That is a bourbon discussion, by the way. That's the other half of this podcast we never ever get to is the bourbon side. So we'll have to have you back on and focus on that area. But shifting sort of to your current area of expertise a little bit, if you don't mind me teeing it up just a little bit. So I was sort of reading a lot of your research work on the AEI's website, and you made you had a couple focus areas around the sort of the fragility and the thinness, sort of the defense industrial base as an area to start with, and I spent almost 3 decades in the United States Army, as you know. But I remember, in 1961, when Eisenhower was giving his farewell speech, he warned us of the military-industrial base complex, right, and the dangers of that. And I'll be honest, in many of the decades I spent in the military, a lot of that warning came true and bore out. But I think now what you've suggested is that we've actually gone the opposite direction, where we've gotten too thin and our supply chain is now maybe essentially compromised by the way we've outsourced. And so what are your thoughts on that, if you don't mind expounding a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, that's right. And remember, there was the word that got crossed out of that Eisenhower speech at the last minute, which was military, industrial, congressional complex. And for whatever reason, he didn't say that. Maybe because he wanted to keep his job, but or keep his, let history shine on him or smile upon him. But, that's right. So at the end of the Cold War in 1991, the wall comes down and Washington celebrates the peace dividend, the end of history, as we were told it would be called. And of course, obviously, extremely naive. But nonetheless, Washington embraced this idea. There was a push at the same time in the 90s, led by Congress and the Government Accountability Office and others, to make government more efficient. And well, I obviously applaud that as a good conservative. The government's also not Ford Motor Company. And so the combination of these two sort of big events were that, the military was cut in half essentially overnight or over a period of years, and kind of stayed small ever since. Even after 9/11, there was some mobilization and some units were called up that hadn't been since World War II. But for the most part, this was a smaller military with, sort of exquisite capabilities. The American innovation and manufacturing and supply chain industrial base that supports our warfighters responded to their customer who wasn't really buying anything anymore. So when you don't buy a lot, you have a monopsony market. You have one company often that makes the one thing you need, and everybody else finds new work, which is a totally logical and rational reaction. So we've had this managed decline of the American defense industrial base over 30 years. And so what takes that long to destroy slowly, it probably will take quite some time to build up, although the last administration and this administration, there's a lot of focus on this because of Congress, but it does take time. And I'm worried about fragility. I'm worried about lack of depth. I'm worried about surge manufacturing capacity in the event of a long war. Well, even in the event of a short war, we're kind of out of Schlitz in our magazine depth in many ways. And really, I'll kind of sum it up by saying, if you zoom out, the big picture for the United States is three things really win wars at the most high level. And of course, one is public support. Two is your treasury, right? Their wars are not cheap. I'd much rather deter the war than fight it. The third is that American manufacturing and innovation defense industrial base that supports cranking out good enough kit when you fire off all your best stuff. And that's where I get nervous a lot.
It seems to me, and I just look back at my own career. I joined the Army in the mid to late '80s, and I served every president through the end of the Obama administration. And I did notice that there was a distinct inflection during the Clinton administration where we seem to have made a decision to outsource a lot of critical components. I mean, we sort of almost began this run down outsourcing everything, and now we're in a position that we became full circle during the COVID period where we have lack of electronics capability because they're mostly supported by China or the regional hegemony that represents the China area of influence, and then we also had pharmaceuticals, et cetera, et cetera. But it does seem like we in the race to sort of provide for global economy and maybe drive procurement prices down. I'm not sure that actually bore out, but at the end of the day, it seems like we did a self-infliction of eroding our own production base. I mean, commercially as well as in the defense area. Do you share that opinion, or is it? Do you see that sort of the same inflection point? I guess you did mention the '90s. That seems to be about where it happened.
I actually think that was really well said. What you had again. When you have a government customer buying so little, and of course you're coming off the Reagan buildup, so again, maybe it was rational, although it's silly to think like you could drive today the same car you had in 1991, but we're flying bombers from the Eisenhower administration still, right, and calling into the question the laws of physics every single day, and really gambling on this with the armed forces. But I think that's a really fair summary. So, like I mentioned, everybody's sort of responding rationally, but without thinking, I guess, Washington is a cyclical town, and it is really, truly short-term focused, very much, a 2-year or less cycle of thinking. But what I see, how did the bureaucracy respond to what you just said? And when you buy so few things, you get some bad apples, they become really outsized headlines, and this is taxpayer money. And so then what happens is Washington values compliance to the rules, and the rules are tens of thousands of pages and low cost, lowest value, best value, low cost above everything else. So not what is the best product, not, take a risk to get something faster. And so what that basically was sand in the gears and everything slows down. And now we have, and then there was a sort of look the other way as all the supply chains moved offshore. And that brought in, a second and third set of challenges and dangers into the system that we're rooting out today, if we even are at all.
So I guess that we arrive in sort of a chicken and the egg situation then when it comes to what you would rightfully call it sort of the fragility of the defense industrial base, where we do have a lot of corporations that make up the defense industrial base, but the levels of provisioning, the levels of supply, particularly around in the munitions area. Although I guess I'm about to say two things. One is sort of what your feel for that is, and the lack of depth of resources. But then the flip side of that is I'm also seeing a distinct shift in our warfighting platforms to autonomous, semi-autonomous, and it seems to be the how do I create a disparity between my aerial platforms and the damage that can be done for a much lower price point. So I guess the first part of the question is, where do you see us in sort of that munitions and supply chain risk? And do you see some mitigating factors in kind of the way the technology is shifting warfighting?
Don't let me forget all those questions. I probably will.
Sorry.
I was like looking for my pen. I got to write all these. So the munition, Go ahead.
No, I don't mean to bombard you. We can
Not at
break these up
all.
into smaller
I was
things.
just being
So,
conversation. I'm just teasing you a little bit, but I was looking
okay.
around for my pen. Uh, Regarding munitions, we do have some of the best military equipment in the world, but they've got to carry or deliver some sort of effect. In most cases, even if that's just troop carrying or supply carrying or intelligence carrying or sensors carrying. But in many cases, we need it to be weapons carrying, and our munitions depth across the board: bombs, missiles, rockets, artillery, mines. The cupboard is bare, pretty bare, and it's not like this thing that happened today. Again, we're talking about a multi-decade decline, and you know, four times in the last 15 years, the United States of America has run out of munitions prosecuting short conflicts. Our allies have run out, and we've had to supply them, like Operation Odyssey Dawn in Libya, where France and the UK, I think it was, I might have it wrong, but countries were running, our own NATO allies were running out of munitions. So this has been like a persistent, knowable thing, but it's a liquid account in the defense budget, and not very much is liquid. So what happened was everybody was in on the take a cut, right? The Army would take a little cut because they had to meet, budgets below inflation. Secretary of Defense's office would take a cut, congressional, appropriators would take a cut, and then what you get is not a lot of stuff. You look around the world, you think, the 9/11, post 9/11 threat environment is what we need. Well, in that world, you don't need artillery, for example. You don't even really need a whole lot of precision munitions, but that's not the enemy of today. And it takes a long time to build this stuff. And so, when President Biden when Ukraine's war didn't end quickly, he turned to his team and said, we need more Stingers, Javelins, and HIMARS. They kind of became household names. He even toured a couple of those factories, and they basically said, you can pour all the money in you want, but it's going to take 2 years to ramp up production. Part of it is the supply chain. In many cases, again, because of a customer that wasn't buying for so long, you have foreign sources of supply, single sources of supply. And then, COVID just accelerated a lot of challenges in obtaining access to raw materials, commodities, trained workers, and everything has now. It's like when the train stops at a sudden screeching halt, and all the train cars smash up against it to the caboose, and that's exactly what's happening in the supply chain right now. And so, while the Defense Department's trying to sort of address it in some select cases, it's almost impossible at this point. You have to just hope that industry will do its part, and taking their cue from what Washington wants them to do, which is basically fix these challenges. Because I'll give you one quick example with aircraft carriers. There's one particular system on the carrier for our newest class, the Ford class carriers, and there's one supplier that builds this particular thing. The backlog for that supplier to deliver it to the Navy is so long that two carriers will be delivered on the same day in a couple of years from now, because once it comes, both of the carriers will be ready, because that's how long it will have took for the backlog to have it will have caught up to now a second ship. And you see this sort of across the board. It's not just munitions. It's not just ships. It's everything. Which it's not all depressing. I don't want it to sound like that. But remind me of your third question.
Well, so now I've come up with another one, because I don't want to leave that spot there. I think we're sort of nibbling on where you're getting around with strategic insolvency and affordability in the defense, but are we arriving at a paucity, or a thinness, if you will, of our supply chain because of the way we've done procurement? Or was it because of reductions in force? Was it a combination thereof? Was it because we did waste, and I say waste, we wasted money in foolhardy things, future combat system and things like that just never saw the light of day, but siphoned off billions of dollars, in my opinion, right? But so clearly there was money to be spent, and there still is money being spent, but how is it we're getting to this disparity between available funding and lack of supply chain?
Again, if you kind of zoom out, it really is that cue or that signal from the top. You might call it the commander's intent, for lack of a better term, for Washington. And
Sure.
the commander's intent has been, we're a peacetime military. You can go at peacetime paces and tempos to do what you need to do. There's no, only just now, I think, is our policymakers saying, we got to break glass in case of emergency, even though we don't have a lot of troops in direct harm's way at this very moment, meaning named military operations or long wars. Washington has looked around and seen how the Red Sea almost broke the Navy, right? Just defeating Houthis in the Red Sea and trying to keep shipping lanes open, for example, and said, well, that's not great. That's signaling to people who are watching very closely, the bad guys who pay the most attention to this, the mullahs in the Middle East, the Putins and Xi's and Kim Jong-un's, and they can see very clearly that we're stretched. It was Washington alone that wasn't seeing that clearly, that phenomenon. So that to me has been one of the biggest issues. I mean, if you think about the Budget Control Act era, which started with the rise of the Tea Party in response to President Obama in 2010 and 2011, and he called it his shellacking. That Congress swept in what was called this massive federal budget cutting exercise, which just proportionately hit the United States military more than any other federal agency. They were almost half the bill payer of that federal debt reduction, even though the military is in the part of the budget that's only a fifth of the pot that you can really, that's liquid. And they're half of that pot, but it's not a very big pot. We don't touch the entitlements, right? Those are on mandatory automatic spending. And that set into motion while we had tens of thousands of troops on the ground in Iraq and Afghanistan dying. I've never, as a very casual student of history, I've never seen that before. Congress started cutting some money for Vietnam, but it was only after it was very nearly and clearly the end. I've never seen Congress do such massive reductions of defense spending while so many people were in direct harm's way.
Yeah, that is interesting. Although we will have to come back on a whole different topic of waste, fraud, and abuse when it comes to those kind of long trailed endeavors. I would like to shift a little bit to China, because I know you've done a lot of research in this area as well, and it is sort of a segue conversation. As we have sort of diversified, or I should say outsourced, much of our supply chain of components, if you will, maybe not the end products, but certainly the components thereof. China plays a big role in this, sadly, with chip production and particularly in the field of electronics. And so to me, that has always been a rather obvious and very stupid thing to have allowed to have happened in the Defense Department, particularly. But then you have sort of the geopolitical view of China in general. I mean, it's just my layperson's view of this, of witnessing sort of how China interacts with the rest of the world, and it's very much China does whatever's in the best interest of China and doesn't really care what the consequences to other nations are, so long as it benefits China in the end result. And that environmentally, technologically, military, industrially, it's very much they don't have any problem with the China first mentality.
Right.
And so, and we have seen, whether it's social media influence, we've seen industrial influence, we've commercially, not even the defense industry, but just commercially, the sort
espionage.
there was a sinofication of a lot of high end commercial activities in the U.S. And now we, of course, see it in the supply chain. And the Ohio class subs, in Microsoft hiring a Chinese national to work on defense contract, those kind of things. What are you had made a comment to me early in our prep session that China is not a near peer competitor. They are a direct competitor. In many cases, have superseded us. Could you talk a little bit more about how you view China and what China looks like in comparison to us right now militarily?
So the Defense Department leadership of 3 administrations now, Trump 1, Biden, and Trump 2, have agreed on one thing almost exclusively, not much else, which is that the Chinese Communist Party military is the pacing threat. It is the primary threat to that the armed forces of America must be prepared to deter and confront and win if needed. And so that's pretty, I think that's a fair assessment, because to your point, to many of those good points, China's increasingly trying to operate as a global power. I think that's why this administration is so concerned about the Western Hemisphere and securing, this sort of region of the world, is to kick out in part China and Russia's malign influence everywhere from Panama Canal to Cuba to Colombia to Venezuela and beyond. Um, and it's all in a variety of different ways. And, America and its allies, our network is the envy of the world, our partners and our friends. And China and Russia, again, are very clearly aware of that. That's sort of our superpower advantage when our military, which is pretty small, is called to do big things. We never do it alone. So being a global power is part of the long game for these revisionist, aggressive, expansionist leaders, Putin and Xi in particular, to bust up America's, grip on global leadership. And of course, we have that grip, which was established after World War II, written, the rules of the road kind of written, stamped, and endorsed by America and upheld by our military because it's in our naked economic self-interest and our well-being, right? If you and I understand, the fiber optic cables and the satellite links that sort of keep everything, and the GPS that keeps markets and cars and companies and ATMs running every single day, it's all upheld by the U.S. military and Coast Guard. And China knows this, and they understand that, if you break our allies and you start to penetrate these systems and make them vulnerable or weak, or establish your own alternate system, which I actually think is the ultimate goal of these bad guys, and to basically assume global leadership role to supplant the United States. That's pretty terrifying stuff. I don't think it matters to Americans until they have to live under the world where the Chinese Communist Party writes the rules. It doesn't sound like a big deal right now. It sounds like this academic, esoteric conversation between Terry and Mackenzie, but it's very real. And Americans bristle at that. I mean, let's just get our tickets now to Young Washington and talk about the Revolutionary War. We just do not do well when we are not writing the rules and we're not on top and we're not winning. But that's very much, I think, what's at stake is these are two systems, two views of the world that are totally antithetical to each other, fighting for top spot.
Yeah, it's almost I sometimes feel conspiratorial, like when I talk about sort of the Chinese social media influence, but there are real kinetic things. I mean, while we're focused on sort of ridiculous things, and we've created internal wars, which I think largely bred by external parties. I mean, there's been China encroaching into what used to be called the Sea of Japan. It's now the South, the South China Sea. I mean, they've renamed it. Everyone was up in arms about the Gulf of America, but China just relabeled an entire swath of the South China Sea, and no one blinked an eye. And
Exactly.
and they've just started to encroach island after an island after island and reclaiming what was international to this Chinese sphere of influence. Or now they're just laying claim to it altogether. Mm-hmm. And so we do see that they are actively, they're pursuing what I would say is a global presence, and they are not underfunding their military, are they?
They are not.
Your studies around Chinese spending, what is it? What is sort of the comparison for spend between the two nations?
Yes, thank you for teeing that up. I hear this a lot in Washington. I'll go on panels or podcasts and have good and important and worthy discussions and debates. But for too long, I'd heard this silly, tired trope, so outdated to the time, that, well, America spends more than the next. It used to be like 15 countries combined, and then it was 12, and then it was 9, and then people stopped saying it because now it's not really clear. Based on my research, it's, China actually outspends us militarily. And I went down that rabbit hole because the United States Senator went to the Senate floor a couple years ago, and they fill their time when they're not in committee hearings, and he gave remarks, public, and said, our America's spy community, our intelligence agencies estimate, this was, like I said, a couple years ago, China's military budget is $700 billion per year. And I thought, well, that's interesting. That's about what ours is this year. But the rest, it's classified after that. So I tried to recreate, to investigate, build from scratch an open source only analysis of, like, is that number even remotely feasible? Because, our intelligence community gets lots of things wrong too. And my number was extremely conservative assumptions and estimates and calculations. And I came up with actually higher than 700 billion plus two other things. China, while they have a global military with global reach and global presence, as you and I have just noted, for the most part, they are concentrating their power in Southeast Asia. So we play an away game. Every bean and bullet, as you know, has to be shipped or flown to wherever we need to deter or project power. So they get more bang for their buck for every dollar that's concentrated in their neighborhood. And then secondly, after I put out my report, I had people calling from all over various places, including U.S. government agencies, saying, yeah, it's as bad as you think it is, Mackenzie, and then more. So I'll give you one quick example. Well, one, the uncounted espionage that we were talking about earlier, which is just astounding, eye-watering how much China is stealing from our innovative American companies, and then just simply, being a fast second mover. But then there's all the uncounted spending, which some I talk about in my report, but a lot of it is market stabilization funds, 60 to 100 billion annually, where they prop up companies till they bankrupt their Western company who can't compete, right? Look at EVs. You've seen this in many markets. Then the Western companies go out of business, they flood the market, and they have global dominance of that industry. Their government pays unprofitable companies and industries with no products or customers to stay viable, just to make sure that the West then no longer can build whatever that thing is. And it's really, you start adding up these Lego blocks, and they're at $1 trillion annually for their military spending, and it shows. So last point, regardless of what we actually think that the minutia is, or each dollar, or did Mackenzie get it right, the output of those inputs speak for themselves. As we've already said, their global presence, their overwhelming mass, their vast defense and commercial subsidization of their defense manufacturing capacity, and on and on. It's pretty obvious, but 3 years ago it was pretty heretical to start that conversation.
Well, they're also not fettered by environmental or green programs or any other consideration. I mean, literally, they will strip mine and pollute whatever is necessary in order to harvest resources. And that's not just in China, that's anywhere that they arrive to operate.
And they are not constrained by a Congress that refuses to pass the military budget on time, and that operates regularly with government shutdowns.
Yeah, and doesn't have a schism in political viewpoints,
Exactly.
right? There's not a lot of counterpoints against the CCP,
That's worth
at least not publicly anyway.
Right.
Yeah, so it's a powerful sort of a capitalist-driven communist dictatorship. I mean, it's been brilliant in its evil manifestation. I mean, really, I'm sure there's some proponents of China, and I'm sure there's lots there, but I think there's more to be concerned about than there is to laud praises of at the moment. And it does create some serious questions about ramifications for us, and even beyond the defense industrial base. So, I mean, think of China's hold on the mineral resources that the world uses, from everything from copper to lithium. Do you see that also manifesting in military defense industrial base implications?
Absolutely, every day. In fact, we're seeing this administration wake up to that and try and hyper react, frankly, where you see unprecedented moves to have the Defense Department or Department of War take partner stakes, equity stakes, ownership of some of these key companies in a direct response to China's actions in these spaces. And it's not, and to your point, it's critical minerals and so much more. And I think it was the Commerce Secretary said, after one of the recent investing in one of these companies, giving the government a stake, said, we're going to do a whole lot more of that. So, and I actually believe him on that front. For good or bad, I'm not an economist, I can't say.
So this is a shifting a little bit more domestically into two different areas, and one just sticks in my craw a little bit. And your research is probably more than my anecdotal statement here, but in a $700 billion budget, as a guy that spent many years in uniform, I volunteered, and I'm very proud of that of service. And it is called selfless service for a reason. But I also find it rather reprehensible that after a $700 billion budget, A, we continually fail audits, and B, we can't even we have soldiers that are getting food stamps and living in subsidized housing. I mean, to me, that's reprehensible in a $700 billion budget. When you look at sort of defense affordability and that kind of disparity, are we doing anything to address any of the above? I mean, and A, clearly there's a lot of money being spent. If it's not being spent in munitions and depth of bench, and it's not being spent on soldiers, sailors, Marines, where the hell is that money going?
It's an excellent question. So, what you find when you do the deep dive is that this is an organization whose spend rate, for a variety of reasons, outpaces inflation every year. And that's anywhere from 2 to 8%, depending on what we're talking about, the consumables of the military, right? The fuel or the food or whatever. And then to buying, sort of equipment, to paying, your workforces. And there are a variety of them, right? You have direct employment and indirect as well. And across those accounts, but if you also look back over the last 25 years, you see budgets that are consistently at or below inflation. So what you do is you end up cutting every year to exist, and you're still managing a decline. You're not really, we fly Eisenhower era bombers for a reason, because you can never get to the next one. When you're just sort of spending all the money to maintain that really, really old one, there's never quite enough to buy the new replacement. And you get into what's basically a doom loop of all of these sort of triaging your investments. You just end up maintaining them and seeing them get smaller and older. But the Defense Department really looks like any other agency on the balance sheet, or any company really, in large ways too, which is, there was a lack of awareness in Washington for a long time that, the single largest item on the balance sheet is the cost of professionals like you, who served freely and of your own free will. Well, if you're super talented and you're taking any sort of risk, well, then you're worth a lot. And your pay, while not ever going to be fully enough, has to be somewhat commensurate with that competition with other industries of America. Because patriotism alone is great, but it can't, pay all the bills. So there was this general lack of, just sort of, well, it's the budget's so big, therefore things must be fine. That kind of mentality, this sort of very simple thinking, is pervasive all over Washington. No surprise, I'm sure, to you. Others on the outside, just a lot of miseducation. And then lastly was the calcification, just sort of things on autopilot. You keep the trains running. You fund the same thing this year that you did last year. You don't really question it. And then what happens is there is some fraud and abuse. There's also maybe things that should have been let go or stopped, or work ended, or workforces adjusted, didn't happen. So I mean, when the world changed, basically the U.S. military gave the world, the internet, email, and precision timing and navigation, which runs financial markets. And then America became a largely service and consumer economy / information. The military followed. Their investments are mostly in service contracts, not equipment anymore, which obviously is a problem.
Really?
Because you have to fight with things, and you have to kill people with stuff. And although I guess you can with some ones and zeros occasionally as well. But the trend lines were just moving in all the wrong directions, and like I mentioned, there's sort of a collective awakening. You just hope it's not too late.
Yeah, and I don't. I honestly think that these are things that are buried in the headlines. We spend more time screaming at one another and blocking traffic than we do, looking at real existential threats to the country. I mean, I don't think most people realize where we are in spending on defense and the things that matter for the defense of the country versus other areas. I do believe, not only amplifying the work of Doge and the work that you've done to sort of illustrate these items, we do need some sort of, I think, budgetary reform. There needs to be a much greater accountability. Like the fact that the Department of Defense can't pass an audit is despicable, in my opinion. It should be the one agency that has glaringly transparent kind of things, other than the small sort of black ops budget. But other than that, I think it should be rather straightforward to see where the money went, right?
Yeah.
But anyway, I will pivot to the last topic because I know you have to go get your car out of Hawk before they tow it. You sit on the I think Women in National Security. You're either is it the position you're chairman? Is it you're on the panel advisory board? What is that role? And so just sort of finishing up, and I like to sort of highlight this, not to pander, but I do believe it's really important for us to inspire the next generation of folks coming into this arena. What advice do you give to young women who may be interested in following in Mackenzie's footsteps, and like what venues or resources were good for you?
Well, please come on in. The work is plenty. The laborers are few. And frankly, national security needs more smart minds, young minds, critical thinkers, and different thinkers to really solve these tough and challenging problems. There's a reason why SpaceX had to help the government get our astronauts out of the space station. Outside and disruptive and new thinking is really it's good. And the problem sets are too interconnected and vast and entrenched for the same people to keep solving them. So the first point I would say is please consider working in policy for government, in national security in particular. Just the clarion call to patriotism and sustaining our freedom and our way of life, which is so important. And that the big complex problems are fun. While there are big problems everywhere else in America, there are things that are unique that only the government can do, or the government only has certain information. So it's kind of just interesting and cool and fun. I joke I've never worked a day in my life because what I do is so fascinating. It's never the same. And so you get to do meaningful, impactful work. And I can see fingerprints of my work in AEIs all over. Good solutions sets in DC and elsewhere. And then lastly, find a good network, assign your mentors. So that was a trick that always worked for me. Over the years, people don't look around and say, I will be your mentor. I would go to meetings, I'd befriend people, we'd get coffee and lunch, and then I would say, I need your help on these problems, or do you have any career advice for this next job, etc. Sometimes I would tell them explicitly, you're my mentor, and sometimes I wouldn't. And those people would change over time. They were usually men because at the time there weren't as many women in national security. But it's okay to have those more mid-career, senior career people helping you along. And lastly, there's no really straight and narrow path. Every path in policy I've seen is really its own. It's unique. It's disjointed. It's not the same as mine as the next person, but they all work. They can be done a variety of ways. But what I have learned in Washington is, it's a small town, like many places in America, with a long memory. And really, at the very end of the day, your reputation and your integrity are all that you're going to have left. And it matters. They matter, really. I think people can come to Washington and think that their power is permanent. And I've always had the Ed Fulner philosophy that there's no permanent victories in Washington. So anyone who comes with that sort of humility will always go far because there's no lack of confidence in this town.
Warranted or otherwise. Mackenzie, I cannot thank you enough. Your work to support not only the warfighter, the work to support our nation's infrastructure and keeping our citizens safe, and your insights are awesome. I cannot express my gratitude deeply enough for you coming on and spending time with us. I encourage our audience to look you up. You have a ton of research that's publicly available. It's fascinating. It's well written. It's very insightful. I went through a majority of it, right? Prepping for this. I think you are truly a national treasure, and we appreciate you in coming on.
Well, thank you. I thank you for all of your treasure. Excuse me. I thank you for all of your service and time spent with me and your great research, but all the work that you've done, and including this podcast, and to think to reach out to me. So thanks for having me. Let's do it again sometime.